John Locke, and the dangerous idea that changed everything. Imagine being told that nothing inside you is fixed. No destiny, no divine imprint. No ideas placed in your mind by birth, just emptiness. A blank page. In the 17th century, this idea was not philosophy. It was a threat, and the man who dared to speak it aloud was John Locke. Born into chaos, not certain. John Locke was born in 1632, in a England tearing itself apart. Rare fact, Locke was born during the English Civil War, a time when kings were executed and authority itself was questioned. Instability shaped him early. Rare fact, his father fought against royal power, quietly planting in Locke a lifelong suspicion of absolute authority. From the beginning, Locke learned one lesson well: power can be wrong. The silent observer Locke was not loud, not theatrical, not revolutionary in appearance. Rare fact, he was known as a deeply private and cautious man, often hiding his most radical ideas for years before publishing them. He observed before he spoke, and what he observed disturbed him. The mind without God-given ideas at Oxford. Locke studied medicine, science, and philosophy. Rare fact, Locke was deeply influenced by empirical science, especially the work of Robert Boyle and early experimental thinkers. He noticed something no one wanted to admit. Ideas did not appear magically. They came from experience, from sensation, from reflection, from the world touching the mind. This led to his most dangerous thought: tabula rasa. The blank slate. Locke proposed that the human mind is born as tabula rasa, a blank slate. Rare fact, this directly challenged religious doctrine that claimed God implanted moral and rational truths at birth. If the mind starts empty, then education matters more than blood. Experience matters more than class. Learning matters more than birthright. This idea terrified the powerful, a philosopher hiding in plain sight. Locke knew the danger of his thinking. Rare fact, he delayed publishing his major philosophical works for decades, fearing political and religious backlash. Instead, he lived carefully. Rare fact, Locke worked as a physician, advisor, and political assistant, blending into society while quietly sharpening his ideas. Philosophy, for Locke, was survival. The body, the mind, and identity. Locke asked a question no one had answered properly. What makes you you? Rare fact, Locke argued that personal identity is based on memory, not the soul or the body. This idea shattered centuries of belief. If memory defines identity, then the self is fragile, changeable, human. The dangerous. Friendships, Locke's ideas attracted powerful allies and enemies. Rare fact, he became closely associated with political radicals who opposed absolute monarchy. This was not theoretical. People were imprisoned or killed for less. Exile and surveillance eventually. Danger caught up with him. Rare fact, Locke was forced into exile in the Netherlands, suspected of political conspiracy. He lived under false names. He burned papers. He watched his words. Even in exile, he kept writing. Truth, to Locke, was worth the risk. Knowledge without certainty. Locke did not believe humans could know everything. Rare fact, he openly admitted the limits of human understanding, arguing that humility was a moral duty. This honesty separated him from dogmatists. He did not promise certainty. He promised progress. The philosopher who waited. By the end of this chapter, John Locke is not yet famous. He's waiting for the right moment, waiting for political safety, waiting to release ideas that could undo kings. The blank slate was only the beginning, because in the next chapter, Locke steps into the public eye, and his ideas ignite revolutions he never lived to see. John Locke and the birth of modern freedom power always tells the same story. It says, is necessary. It says it is natural. It says it knows better than you. John Locke did not believe it. And in the late 17th century, that disbelief was revolutionary. Return from exile. Return with fire. When Locke returned from exile in the Netherlands, England had changed. Rare fact, Locke returned during the Glorious Revolution, a bloodless overthrow of absolute monarchy. Kings were no longer untouchable, and Locke arrived with ideas ready to finish the job. The book that was never meant to be safe, Locke published treatises of government quietly. Rare fact. He originally denied authorship, fearing political retaliation. The book was a weapon. Government is not divine. Locke attacked the core belief of monarchy. Rare fact. Locke explicitly rejected the idea that kings ruled by divine right. Authority, he argued, came from the people. Not heaven, not blood, not tradition. Consent was everything. The state of nature, not hell, but risk, unlike Hobbes. Locke did not believe humans were monsters by nature. Rare fact. Locke believed humans in the state of nature possessed reason and moral sense, but lacked impartial enforcement. Chaos was not inevitable. Abuse was life, liberty, property. Locke defined 3 natural rights. Rare fact. Locke considered property an extension of personal labor, not privilege. You owned what you worked for, not what you inherited. This idea shook aristocracies across Europe. When government fails, rebellion is moral here, was Locke's most dangerous claim. Rare fact. Locke argued that rebellion against unjust government is morally justified. Not sinful, not criminal. Necessary. This idea would echo across centuries. Locke never called for violence. Rare fact. He framed revolution as a defensive response, not aggression. Power that violated rights dissolved itself. The people merely acknowledged the fact. Religious toleration with limits. Locke's vision extended beyond politics. Rare fact. Locke argued for religious tolerance in an era of brutal sectarian violence. Belief, he said, could not be forced. However, rare fact, he controversially excluded atheists and certain religious groups from full tolerance, revealing the limits of even radical thinkers. The education of a free mind. Locke believed freedom was learned. Rare fact, he wrote extensively on education, arguing that character mattered more than memorization. Discipline without cruelty. Learning without fear. A mind trained for reason, not obedience. The thinker who never ruled. Locke never sought power. Rare fact. He avoided public office whenever possible, preferring influence over authority. He understood something rulers rarely do. Ideas rule longer than kings. The seed planted by the end of chapter 2, Locke's ideas had escaped him. They traveled silently, across oceans, across revolutions, across centuries. And in the final chapter, those ideas will reshape the modern world, often in ways Locke himself never imagined. John Locke and the invisible architecture of the modern world. Most revolutions end. Ideas do not. John Locke never commanded armies, never ruled a nation, never stood on a battlefield, yet his thoughts quietly rewired the world, and you are living inside them. The philosopher who crossed the ocean. Locke's ideas did something extraordinary. They traveled. Rare fact. Locke's writings heavily influenced the American founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Words written in 17th century England became the backbone of a new nation. From philosophy to constitution, life, liberty, and property. Rare fact. Jefferson's phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is a direct philosophical adaptation of Locke. The transformation was subtle, but radical. Happiness replaced property, but freedom remained sacred. The man who limited democracy, Locke, believed in freedom, but not equality as we understand it today. Rare fact. Locke supported property-based voting rights, excluding large portions of society. His vision was revolutionary and incomplete. This tension defines modern democracy, slavery, and silence. One of the most uncomfortable truths remains. Rare fact. Locke was involved in drafting policies connected to colonial governance that indirectly supported slavery. This contradiction haunts his legacy. A philosopher of freedom, trapped in his century. The paradox of tolerance. Locke preached tolerance with boundaries. Rare fact. He believed some beliefs threatened social order and should be restricted. Freedom, for Locke, was never absolute. It required reason. The mind is a living process. Locke's blank slate reshaped psychology. Rare fact, his ideas directly influenced modern developmental psychology and education theory. Learning was no longer destiny. It was design. The limits of knowing Locke warned against certainty. Rare fact, he argued that chasing absolute knowledge leads to tyranny, intellectual and political. Doubt, he believed, was a form of wisdom. A quiet death. A loud legacy. Locke died peacefully in 1704. Rare fact, he spent his final years writing, reading, and reflecting, not defending his ideas. He knew something profound. The work was already done. The world Locke never saw. Locke never saw. Expand never saw universal education. Never saw human rights declarations. But his fingerprints are everywhere. In courts. In classrooms. In constitutions. The final question, if the mind begins empty, if power comes from consent, if rebellion can be moral, then the question is no longer about Locke. It is about you. What are you writing on your blank slate?